historian. Dear viewers, and another quiet journey through time. Tonight, beneath the hush of the stars, we drift back to the days before towering skylines and rushing streets, to a place where rivers whispered, lanterns glowed, and the seeds of a great city were only just being sown. This is the story of New York, before 200 years ago, a tale that begins in forests and villages, winds through Dutch ports and English harbors, trembles in the smoke of revolution, and finally glimmers with the promise of canals and commerce. Close your eyes, let your breath soften, and allow the gentle rhythm of history to carry you. Together, we will walk slowly through the centuries, by firelight and candlelight, where voices of the past still linger, and the city's destiny unfolds like a dream. The first peoples of the region, long before the towers of stone and steel rose upon the island of Manhattan, long before ships with white sails crossed the Atlantic winds, there were people here, people who called this land their home, who spoke in voices carried softly by the river, and who lived with the rhythm of the forests, the valleys, and the lakes. The land we now call New York was a place of great abundance. The rivers shone silver with fish, and the woods echoed with the cries of deer, bear, and bird. The winters were cold, the summers green and generous. For countless generations, the Lenape people lived along the lower river valleys, where the tides of the great Hudson ebbed and flowed. To the north and west, stretched the homelands of the Iroquois, or the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. Together, these nations formed one of the most remarkable alliances in the history of the world. The Haudenosaunee spoke of their world as a vast longhouse. In their imagination, the great wooden frame of the sky itself was the roof, and the fertile earth beneath their feet, the floor. From the Mohawk Nation in the east to the Seneca in the west, the land was held as one home, with many fires burning along its length. They were different nations, yet united, sharing peace and law through a great council. In the villages of the Mohawk, the keepers of the eastern door, longhouses stretched along clearings by the riverbanks. Built of wood and bark, these long arched dwellings were homes for many families together, bound not only by blood but by the ties of clan. Within them, the air was warm with the smoke of central hearths, rising through small holes in the roof, while the smell of cornmeal, beans, and roasted squash mingled with the fire. Farther west, the Seneca guarded the western door of the longhouse of their world. Their fields, rich and green, rolled out toward the Finger Lakes, where waters shimmered like polished stone beneath the sun. Canoes glided silently across the water, carrying traders, messengers, and hunters. Children's laughter filled the air as they played by the shorelines, while the elders sat in quiet circles, passing down stories older than memory. The Lenape, meanwhile, dwelt closer to the salt tides of the sea, their lives interwoven with the estuaries and marshlands of the lower Hudson. They were skilled fishers and traders, their canoes light and swift, their paths winding through forests that would one day be paved into streets. Yet in those days they moved with the trees, the rivers, and the seasons, never imagining that foreign sails would one day change everything. But tonight, we need not rush to that future. Tonight, we linger in the world they knew. The forests were alive not just with animals but with spirits. To walk through them was to be reminded that all life was connected. The deer that gave its flesh, the corn that grew from the soil, the rivers that offered fish, the fire that gave warmth, and the sky that carried rain. To the Haudenosaunee and Lenape alike, the world was not a thing to be owned, but a gift to be respected. Their council fires burned bright. Leaders were not kings in the manner of Europe, but caretakers chosen by their people. Women held power, two clan mothers guided decisions, and it was they who had the right to choose or remove leaders. It was a society built on balance, on listening, on honoring both earth and voice. When the moon rose full above the forests, casting silver across the rivers, stories would be told. Stories of Sky Woman, who fell from the heavens and was carried upon the back of a great turtle, whose shell became the very earth. Stories of the Peacemaker, who brought an end to endless warring and united the 5 nations beneath a single law of peace. These were not tales of idle fancy, but living truths, binding the people to their past, their present, and their future. Imagine, if you will, a night in such a village. The fire crackles softly, embers glowing like stars fall into the earth. Around you, the night is filled with the hum of insects, the croak of frogs, and the distant call of an owl. The smell of wood smoke and cedar drifts through the air. Children press close to their mothers as an elder begins to speak, his voice slow, steady, each word a thread in a tapestry woven across generations. The stories are not merely entertainment, they are lessons, reminding all who listen how to live rightly with the land and with one another. In these ways, the first peoples of the region laid a foundation deeper than stone. For thousands of years, they shaped the land and were shaped by it. They cleared fields for crops, yet left the forests standing. They hunted, yet with prayer and gratitude. They traded, not with gold or silver, but with wampum beads carved from shells, each one strung with meaning and memory. It is easy, when looking back through the long corridors of time, to imagine their world as silent, empty, waiting for Europeans to arrive. But this is far from truth. The land was alive with voices, footsteps, laughter, debates, songs, and ceremonies. The people of the Lenape and the Haudenosaunee were not shadows, but nations, with wisdom, laws, and dreams of their own. This was the world before 1609, before the sails of Henry Hudson cut across the horizon. A world of rivers and canoes, of longhouses and council fires, of cornfields swaying in the summer wind. A world that held within it the roots of New York's history, though the city itself was yet unborn. And as we close our eyes tonight, we may still hear their whispers, the soft rhythm of paddles upon water, the murmur of leaves in the wind, the steady voice of the elder telling stories by firelight. They remind us that New York's first history was not one of walls or towers, but of rivers and forests, and of people who walked gently upon the land. Life and traditions. When dawn crept over the forests of the land we now call New York, the world stirred gently awake. Mist rose from the rivers like white breath upon the morning air. The longhouses stood quiet, their rounded roofs glistening with dew. And then, slowly, the sounds of life began, the crackle of the hearth fire being stoked, the soft voices of women tending to children, and the calls of men preparing to hunt or walk to the fields. For the Lenape and the nations of the Haudenosaunee, life was lived in harmony with the turning of the seasons. Spring, summer, autumn, and winter each had their work, their ceremonies, and their blessings. In the warm months, fields stretched wide, green with the growth of the Three Sisters. Corn rose tall, her stalks swaying in the wind. Round her feet wound beans, their vines climbing upward. At the base, broad leaves of squash spread like a shelter, keeping the soil moist and shaded. To the people, these were not just crops, but sisters' companions, each supporting the other, each a gift of the earth. Together, they fed the villages with abundance and strength. In the early light of morning, women moved gracefully through the fields, their hands tending the plants with care, their voices humming songs as old as memory. Children followed, laughing as they chased grasshoppers and butterflies, learning from their mothers and grandmothers the ways of planting and harvesting. For it was the women who held the knowledge of the fields, who passed down the stories of seeds, and who ensured that the people would never hunger. Meanwhile, men ventured into the forests and rivers, carrying bows, spears, or fishing lines. They hunted deer, whose hides became clothing, and whose meat sustained the villages through the cold months. They fished the rivers, where salmon and sturgeon swam thick beneath the surface. They returned not only with food, but with stories of the woods, the tracks of bear, the cries of hawks, the sudden shadow of an eagle overhead. Yet daily life was not only work, it was also celebration, ritual, and balance. The people believed that every ACP planting a seed, catching a fish, felling a tree must be done with respect. Gratitude was offered in words, in prayer, in song. When the first corn was harvested, the Green Corn Festival was held, a time of feasting, dancing, and thanksgiving to the earth and sky. In winter, when the nights grew long and the land lay silent beneath snow, it was the season of storytelling. Around the fire, the elders would tell of the great beings, of Sky Woman, of the Peacemaker, of spirits who moved unseen, yet were always present. Life was woven with meaning. The longhouse itself was more than shelter, it was a reflection of their world. Its wooden frame curved like the ribs of a great being, its central fire a symbol of unity. Families of the same clan, wolf, turtle, bear, lived together within its walls, bound by kinship, and though many fires might burn along its length, the longhouse was one. Just as the nations of the Haudenosaunee were many yet united as one, each clan carried its duties and its stories. The turtle clan might remind others of patience and endurance, the wolf clan of loyalty and guardianship, the bear clan of strength and healing. To belong to a clan was to belong to a living story, passed down from generation to generation. Leadership, too, was guided by tradition. Chiefs, known as sachems, were chosen not by ambition or wealth, but by the voices of the people, and most especially by the wisdom of the clan mothers. These women, revered as keepers of the lineages, had the power to raise up leaders or to remove them if they failed to serve rightly. This balance between men and women gave the society strength, for no voice stood above the others, and no decision was made without careful listening. Children were taught early to listen as well to the voices of their elders, to the stories of their people, and to the lessons of the earth. They learned to respect the animals they hunted, to give thanks for the plants they gathered, to understand that all things were connected. A child might be given a small bough, or a basket, and sent into the woods not only to practice skill, but to practice patience, awareness, and gratitude. The world itself was their teacher. The rivers taught them of journey and flow, the mountains taught endurance, the forests taught shelter, silence, and renewal. To walk through such a world was to walk in a great circle of lessons, where every tree, every stone, and every star overhead was alive with meaning. And so, the people lived not in haste, but in rhythm. The cycle of planting and harvest, of hunting and feasting, of ceremony and story, shaped their days. The seasons were not feared but welcomed, each carrying its gift. Imagine, if you will, one such evening in a village. The fields lie quiet, the stalks of corn rustling softly in the wind. The hunters have returned, their game prepared for the meal. Smoke drifts gently from the longhouses, curling upward into a violet twilight sky. Children play at the edge of the clearing, their laughter echoing through the trees, and in the center, the people gather for a dance, their feet moving in rhythm, their voices raised in song. The drum beats low and steady, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. This was life for the Lenape, for the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Seneca, a life of balance between work and rest, between duty and joy, between the individual and the whole. Their traditions were not just customs, but living laws, binding them to each other and to the land. And though centuries have passed, and much of their world has changed, their songs and stories still echo in the soil of New York. Beneath the stone streets, beneath the tall towers, the memory of cornfields, long houses, and council fires remains, like embers glowing softly in the dark. Trade and travel. The land that we now call New York was not a world closed in upon itself. It was a land of rivers, valleys, lakes, and winding paths, routes that carried voices and goods far beyond the horizon. To the first peoples of the region, travel and trade were the threads that bound village to village, nation to nation, and people to people. Imagine the Hudson River, long before the white sails of Europeans appeared upon its waters. It was a broad, shining artery, flowing like a silver ribbon through the heart of the land. Along its banks stood forests deep and endless, yet upon its surface moved canoes, long and narrow, cut from the trunks of great trees. Silent but swift, they glided across the current, paddles dipping in rhythm, carrying men and women, children and goods, from one settlement to another. The Lenape, who lived along the river's lower stretches, were skilled navigators of its tides. They moved with the water, upstream and downstream, carrying shells from the sea, furs from the forests, and food from their fields. To the north and west, the Haudenosaunee nations also traveled by water, paddling across the Finger Lakes or down rivers that eventually met the Hudson. Each journey carried more than trade, it carried connection. For trade was not only the passing of goods, but the weaving of relationships. A string of wampum beads, carved from white and purple shells, might pass from one hand to another, each bead polished smooth, each one carrying meaning. Wampum was more than ornament, it was memory, a record, a promise. Messages of peace, agreements between nations, and the words of the great law itself were spoken and remembered with strings of wampum. In the bustling gatherings of markets, the air was filled with voices. Furs of beaver and deer, soft and warm, were exchanged for corn or woven mats. Shells from the coast found their way inland, while obsidian, copper, and flint traveled from faraway lands. The Haudenosaunee traded with the Algonquian-speaking peoples to the east, with tribes across the Great Lakes, and even with nations far to the south. But not all trade was by water. Paths wound through the forests, some so well trodden they seemed as ancient as the trees themselves. These trails linked village to village, often marked by signs known only to those who walked them. In time, some of these very paths would become roads, and later still, the great avenues of New York City. Yet in those early days, they were quiet trails beneath the trees, carrying moccasin feet across the soil. Travel was not only for trade, it was also for ceremony and for diplomacy. Messengers journeyed between nations, bearing words of peace or news of conflict. Runners moved swiftly along the trails, carrying messages across great distances with remarkable speed. The council fire of the Haudenosaunee drew leaders from across the longhouse of their world, gathering to speak, to listen, to decide. Each journey was a thread in the great web of life, keeping the nations bound together. And still, the rivers carried more than canoes and goods, they carried stories. Travelers spoke of distant lakes, of forests that stretched without end, of mountains rising like guardians above the land. Children, listening to such tales, dreamed of journeys they themselves might one day take. Travel, however, was not without danger. Storms could rise upon the rivers. A canoe might tip upon hidden rocks, spilling its contents into the water. Wild animals lurked in the forests, and sometimes rivalries between nations turned paths unsafe. Yet even in such times, the need to move, to trade, to connect, drew people onward, for life was not possible without these bonds. Picture, if you will, a day in midsummer. The sun gleams upon the Hudson, its waters sparkling like glass. From a bend in the river emerges a canoe, carved of oak, steady and strong. In it sit two men, their paddles flashing in the light. Behind them lies a bundle of furs, the soft pelts of beaver, carefully wrapped. Ahead, at the river's edge, stands a small gathering of traders. Children wave, women stand waiting, and soon the canoe slides ashore. Voices rise in greeting, hands clasp in welcome, and trade begins not hurried, not careless, but with ceremony and respect. For each exchange is a thread of trust. In the evenings, after a long day's journey, travelers would sit by their fires, the glow casting warm light upon the trees. They spoke quietly, their words carrying into the dark. Above them, the stars glittered, vast and uncountable. To the Haudenosaunee, the stars themselves were a kind of map, guiding the traveler just as surely as the rivers and trails. And when sleep came, it came with the sound of flowing water, of the forest breathing, of the world moving around them. Thus, Trade and travel were the lifeblood of the land. They carried not only goods but friendship, not only wealth but wisdom. They made the world wide, even before the arrival of ships from across the ocean. For though the people of the Hudson Valley, of the Finger Lakes, of the coastal marshes may have lived in villages surrounded by forest, they were never alone. They were part of a vast, living network, bound together by canoes, by trails, by wampum, and by trust. This, too, is part of New York's earliest history, a history not of walls or boundaries, but of rivers flowing endlessly, and people moving upon them, their lives as fluid and connected as the waters themselves. Harmony and conflict. The world of the first peoples was a place of balance, but balance is never still. It shifts, it sways, like the branches of a tree in the wind. There was harmony, yes, but there was also conflict, for no people live forever in peace, and even the strongest bonds are tested by time. Among the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, harmony was cherished as a sacred gift. They told the story of the great peacemaker, who came long ago when the nations were at war with one another. In those days, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca fought bitterly, raiding and clashing, their lands stained with sorrow. But the peacemaker brought words of unity. He showed them the great law, a law not written on parchment but woven into memory, carried by voices, bound in wampum. He spoke of a great tree of peace, its roots stretching out in 4 directions, its branches sheltering all who sought rest beneath them. At its top, an eagle watched with sharp eyes, ready to cry out if danger approached. Beneath it, the nations buried their weapons, ending their endless feuds. From that time on, the 5 nations sat in council, their words guided by the desire for balance, their decisions measured by patience. This was harmony. The voices of many joined as one, each nation keeping its place, each clan its duty, each leader accountable to the people and to the clan mothers who chose them. It was a harmony not of silence but of many voices woven together, like strands in a basket, each necessary, each strong. Yet even harmony has shadows. Though the Haudenosaunee were united, the world beyond their Longhouse was filled with other peoples: the Lenape, the Mohican, the Abenaki, the Algonquin. Sometimes trade and friendship flourished. Paths and rivers carried gifts and words of peace. But at other times, there were disputes over hunting grounds, over rivers, over honor. Then, the canoes that once carried traders might instead carry warriors, their faces painted, their weapons ready. To the south, the Lenape lived in villages closer to the sea, their lives bound to the tides and marshes. They too knew both harmony and conflict. Within their own communities, they shared the labor of fields and rivers, celebrated festivals, and gathered for ceremonies. But beyond their villages, rivalries sometimes arose with neighbors who sought the same hunting grounds, or who wished to control the flow of trade along the great river. And so, life was not a perfect circle of peace, but a dance sometimes graceful, sometimes fierce. Imagine, if you will, a clearing on a summer morning. A council fire burns low, its smoke curling into the still air. Around it sit leaders of neighboring nations. Their words are careful, their tones measured, as they seek to resolve a dispute over land or trade. Strings of wampum lie between them, their beads glimmering in the light, each string carrying the memory of promises made, of agreements kept or broken. Voices rise, then fall into silence. The fire crackles softly. At last an agreement is reached, and the strings are passed once more into waiting hands. But imagine, too, another scene. The forest, quiet beneath the stars. A party of warriors moves like shadows, their footsteps silent on the earth. They carry bows and clubs, their breath misting in the night air. For not every conflict could be ended at the council fire. At times, old grievances boiled into raids, sudden and fierce, where villages woke to cries in the dark. In such moments, harmony broke, and conflict flared like lightning. Still, through both peace and strife, the people endured. The Haudenosaunee kept their council fire burning, their tree of peace standing tall. The Lenape kept their villages alive along the riverbanks, their festivals bright, their traditions strong. They knew that life itself was woven of both light and shadow, that peace and conflict walked side by side. When a child was born, there was celebration, songs sung, names given. When a hunter fell in the forest, there was mourning, but also gratitude for his spirit. When war erupted, the people grieved, but when peace was restored, they rejoiced, and feasts were held to heal the wounds. It is easy, when we look back across the centuries, to imagine only one side, to picture either a golden age of endless harmony or a dark age of endless strife. But the truth, as always, is more delicate. The first peoples lived with both, and they understood that to walk in balance meant to accept that conflict, like winter, would sometimes come, and that harmony, like spring, would return again. As night falls upon this chapter of history, let us picture once more the great tree of peace. Its branches spread wide, its roots stretch deep, and at its crown, the eagle keeps watch. Beneath its shelter, the nations of the Haudenosaunee sit together, their council fire glowing. Beyond them, the Lenape villages hum with life, their people moving along the river. And beyond them still, the forests whisper with wind, reminding us that peace and conflict are both part of the human story. So ends part 1 of our tale, a world of first peoples, of rivers and forests, of traditions, travel, and the dance between harmony and strife. A world that laid the first foundation stones of the land that would one day be called New York. Hudson's journey. The year was 1609. Across the restless Atlantic, sails caught the wind, their canvas stretching like the wings of pale birds. The sea groaned beneath them, carrying men who gazed at the endless horizon with wonder and unease. Among them was Henry Hudson, an Englishman by birth, a navigator by fate, who now sailed under the Dutch flag. His ship was called the Half Moon, the Half Moon, and upon its deck, history began to stir. Hudson's task was simple in words, though impossibly grand in truth, to find a passage to the riches of Asia by sailing west. The oceans had become maps of ambition, every wave carrying the dreams of kings, merchants, and empires. Yet, as often happens in tales of exploration, what he found was not what he sought. Picture, if you will, the Half Moon drifting through mist. Her timbers creaked, her sails strained, and the men aboard whispered of unknown lands ahead. They had left the salt air of the open sea, and now moved into calmer waters, where gulls wheeled overhead, and the scent of pine and earth drifted on the breeze. For the first time, they were entering the river that would one day bear Hudson's name. The river itself seemed to welcome and resist them all at once. Its waters ran deep and strong, winding between cliffs that rose like watchful giants. Forests pressed close to the banks, their branches whispering secrets in the wind. Fish darted beneath the surface, and deer, startled by the strange vessel, fled into the undergrowth. For the crew, it must have felt as though they had slipped into another world. The land was vast, unbroken, alive with birdsong and the crackle of unseen life in the trees. Smoke curled from distant fire signs of villages, of people whose ancestors had lived there for centuries. The Lenape and the Mohican watched from the shore, their eyes fixed on the strange floating house of wood and cloth that moved against the current. Some hid in silence, wary of the newcomers, while others came forth in canoes, paddling swiftly, their movements graceful as the river itself. There was curiosity, and there was caution. The first exchanges were made in gestures, in gifts. Strings of beads, food, and furs passed from one hand to another. The Dutch sailors marveled at the softness of deerskin, the beauty of carved ornaments, the warmth of hospitality from strangers whose language they did not speak. The Lenape marveled in turn at metal knives, at beads of glass that shone like captured drops of sky, at cloth woven in patterns never before seen. Hudson himself must have stood upon the deck, gazing at the vast river with wonder. It stretched so far, so steady, that it seemed it might lead across the continent itself. He hoped, perhaps, that it would be the path to the fabled East. Each bend of the river seemed to promise the ocean beyond, though always it bent again, carrying him deeper inland. The Half Moon sailed northward, its sails bright against the September sun. Villages appeared along the bank, smoke rising, children running to the shore, elders watching in silence. Some welcomed the newcomers, trading eagerly, while others turned away, distrust shadowing their faces. For the people of the river had their own long histories of alliance and rivalry, and the sudden arrival of strangers hinted at change, a ripple that might one day become a storm. As the days passed, the river carried Hudson and his men more than 100 miles into the land. They anchored near mountains cloaked in autumn color, their peaks touched with early frost. Nights were quiet but for the crackling of campfires and the calls of owls in the trees. The men ate from their dwindling stores, and from the gifts of corn and fish given by those they met, and always, Hudson measured and noted, his eyes fixed on the dream of a passage that was not to be. For at last, the river narrowed, its current stronger, its depth too shallow for the great ship. The Half Moon could go no further. Hudson's dream of finding a route to Asia dissolved like mist in morning sun. But though he did not know it, he had found something else, a land that would draw the Dutch back again and again. Not for spices or silks, but for furs, for trade, for the promise of a new colony. When the Half Moon turned back downriver, the forests seemed to close in once more, the villages retreating into shadow. The Lenape and the Mohican still watched, their eyes following the ship as it drifted away. Some must have wondered if these pale strangers would ever return. Others must have known in their hearts that they surely would. And so, the river received its new name, Hudson's River. But long before the maps bore that name, it was already the river of the Lenape, the Mohawk, the river that flows both ways. To them, it had always been life itself. To Hudson, it was discovery. To the Dutch merchants who would soon follow, it was opportunity. Thus began the Dutch era, not with conquest, but with a journey, one ship, one river, and a meeting between two worlds. A quiet beginning, yet one that carried within it the seeds of change. For from this river's banks would grow the city that would one day be New York. And so we leave Hudson for the night, his ship drifting on the dark waters, his men weary, their hearts filled with both hope and uncertainty. Above them, the stars gleam in the September sky, eternal witnesses to the first chapter of a new age. Founding of New Netherland. When Henry Hudson returned to Europe with his tale of a wide and noble river flowing through a land of forests and valleys, his story caught the ears of merchants and dreamers alike. For though he had not found the passage to Asia, he had uncovered another kind of treasure, an untouched world, rich in furs, where beaver pelts softer than velvet and more prized than gold in Europe could be gathered in great number. The Dutch were quick to seize upon this chance. They were a people of traders, their ships roaming from Africa to the East Indies, their cities bustling with markets and guilds. And so, in the years that followed Hudson's voyage, the Dutch merchants organized under the mighty Dutch West India Company prepared to plant a colony in this new land. They called it New Netherland. It began quietly, with small parties of traders. They built outposts along the river, no more than wooden huts at first, their chimneys sending thin plumes of smoke into the wilderness sky. There, they traded with the native peoples, the Lenape, the Mohican, and others who dwelt in the forests and valleys. Beaver pelts, supple and warm, passed into Dutch hands. In return came knives, metal pots, bright beads, and woven cloth. But in 1624, the company resolved to make the colony more permanent. That spring, ships crossed the Atlantic, carrying the first family settlers who would work the land, who would build homes, who would claim the country not just for trade but for living. They came from many places, Holland, Wallonia, even France, drawn by the promise of opportunity. Their landing place was Noten Island, or Governor's Island, a small green jewel of land at the edge of the great harbor. Imagine them stepping ashore, their boots sinking into damp earth, their eyes sweeping across a bay alive with gulls and fish. To the west lay the low hills of what would one day be New Jersey, to the east the forested stretches of Long Island, and before them the long finger of Manhattan, wrapped in trees and silence. It was a new world, vast and waiting, though already filled with the lives and histories of the native nations. The settlers built huts of timber and red. They dug gardens where beans and squash could grow. They raised palisades of wood to guard against storms, beasts, and, perhaps, unfriendly eyes. They prayed together in the evenings, their psalms drifting over the darkening waters. The wind off the harbor was sharp, and the nights could be long, but the colony endured. The following years brought more ships, more settlers. The Dutch claimed lands up the Hudson River, raising a fort at Orange, today's Albany, where the river narrowed and the fur trade thrived. They raised another fort upon the Delaware. Yet all of these were but branches of the tree whose trunk stood at the southern tip of Manhattan Island. There, in 1626, they founded a settlement that would one day change the world, New Amsterdam. But before that chapter opens, the colony of New Netherland remained fragile, like a sapling bending in the wind. Its people depended not only on their own strength but on the goodwill of their neighbors, the Lenape, the Mohawk, the Mohican. Trade bound them together. Yet trust was a fragile thing, as thin as the edge of a blade. There were moments of peace, of laughter exchanged across fires, of shared meals. There were also moments of misunderstanding, of tension that simmered beneath the surface. Still, life in New Netherland was unlike life in Europe. Here, men and women from many corners of the world found themselves living side by side. Dutch farmers, Walloon families, French Huguenots, and soon Africans. Brought not as settlers but as enslaved laborers, all became part of the fabric of the colony. In its earliest days, it was already a place of mingling voices, a patchwork of tongues, a seed of the diversity that would one day define New York itself. And so, by the close of the 1620s, New Netherland was no longer a dream on parchment maps, but a living place. Its forts guarded river crossings, its fields sprouted corn and wheat, and its harbor bustled with ships. Still small, still fragile, yet it breathed with the rhythm of a new world being born. The Dutch merchants in Amsterdam rejoiced. Each ship that returned carried bundles of fur, the soft wealth of the wilderness, bound for the markets of Europe. Each voyage promised profit, each season the strengthening of a new foothold across the sea. What Hudson had glimpsed in mist and autumn light was now being woven into the fabric of empire. But far from the counting houses of Holland on the edge of the wild Atlantic, the settlers lived their lives by humbler measures: the planting of fields, the mending of nets, the telling of stories by firelight, the prayers for safe passage through winter storms. Their colony was young, yet they held within them the hope of permanence, the quiet certainty that New Netherland was not just a place on a map, but home. And so, the story of New York crept forward, its roots sinking deeper into the soil of Manhattan. Even as its branches stretched outward across rivers and bays, the sapling had been planted. Soon it would grow. New Amsterdam. It was the year 1626. The harbor of the New World shimmered beneath a pale spring sun. Across its waters, a Dutch ship, the Severin Provinciën, approached the wooded island, the Lenape, called Mannahatta, the island of many hills. On board were supplies, settlers, and the man chosen to govern this fragile new colony, Peter Minuit. The tale most often told is that Minuit met with the Lenape and purchased the island of Manhattan for a handful of trade goods, beads, cloth, and tools worth 60 guilders. Whether the exchange was a true purchase in the European sense is uncertain, for to the Lenape land was not a thing one could own or sell. To them, it was a gift from the Creator, to be shared among all who lived upon it. Yet the Dutch believed the island theirs, and from this meeting, a settlement was born, New Amsterdam. At first it was no more than a cluster of rough wooden houses huddled near the southern tip of the island. The settlers built them from the timbers of the forest, their roofs thatched, their chimneys of stone. Smoke rose gently into the air, curling above the treetops. Around them, fields were cleared, gardens planted, livestock tended. At the very edge of wilderness, they carved a place to call home. The heart of the settlement was Fort Amsterdam, a stout fort of earth and timber, its walls enclosing a small parade ground and a few storehouses. From its bastions, one could look out across the broad bay, watching the sails of ships gliding in from the ocean. Behind the fort, narrow lanes stretched into the settlement, little more than dirt tracks at first, yet destined to grow into the bustling streets of a future city. Life in New Amsterdam was simple, yet busy. By dawn, the streets stirred with activity, women drawing water from the wells, men carrying tools to the fields, children chasing each other past goats and chickens. The air was filled with the sounds of hammers on wood, saws biting through beams, merchants shouting their wares, and the clatter of carts over uneven ground. It was not only Dutch voices that rang in the air. Already, the settlement was a mingling of peoples, Walloons from Belgium, Huguenots from France, Germans, Scandinavians, Africans, both free and enslaved, all found themselves living side by side. Though small, the town pulsed with diversity, its streets alive with many tongues. Some prayed in quiet chapels, others kept to their old customs, but together they shaped a settlement unlike any other in the New World. And always, there was the river. The Hudson was the lifeline of New Amsterdam, bearing canoes from upriver filled with furs, and Dutch ships heavy with supplies, wine, cloth, and tools. Along the docks, traders bartered with native people, exchanging bright beads and iron kettles for bundles of soft beaver pelts. From these pelts, fine felt hats would be made in Europe, coveted in the courts of kings. The wealth of the wilderness flowed through New Amsterdam, and the little town began to prosper. Yet life was not without its challenges. Winters were harsh, with snow piling high against the wooden houses and food sometimes running scarce. Relations with neighboring tribes could shift swiftly from friendship and trade to tension and fear. Disease, carried across the sea by the settlers, crept through the land, leaving sorrow in its wake. And always there lingered the uncertainty of a colony far from home, with the ocean stretching endlessly between it and the cities of Holland. Still, the settlers endured. They raised families, planted orchards, brewed beer, baked bread, and told stories by firelight. On Sundays, they gathered in their small church within the fort, their hymns rising into the cold air. Children were born who had never seen Europe, who called this wilderness their homeland. New Amsterdam, fragile though it seemed, was becoming more than a trading post. What was becoming a community? By the 1630s, the settlement stretched further north along the island. Farms dotted the land, windmills turned their sails in the wind, and the streets grew busier with each passing year. At night, lanterns glowed in the windows, their lights spilling onto dirt paths that would one day become Broadway, Pearl Street, and Wall Street. The city that would one day be called New York was taking its first breaths. And so, amid the mingling of languages, the rhythm of trade, and the laughter of children playing among the goats and geese, New Amsterdam lived, still small, still vulnerable, yet alive with promise. A foothold of Europe and America, a bridge between worlds. A seed that would one day grow into one of the greatest cities upon the earth. For now, though it was simply a town of wooden houses and narrow lanes, where smoke rose gently into the sky and the tide of the river whispered against the shore, a Dutch colony at its peak, by the middle of the 17th century, New Amsterdam was no longer a fragile outpost clinging to the edge of a wilderness. It had grown into a lively little town, its streets busy with merchants, farmers, sailors, and children. Wooden houses leaned close to one another, their gabled roofs sharp against the sky, while smoke curled upward from chimneys into the salty harbor air. The colony of New Netherland was alive, and for a brief shining time, it flourished. Each morning began with the sound of the harbor. Ships rocked gently at their moorings, their sails furled, their decks alive with movement. Men hauled barrels ashore, their voices calling out in Dutch, French, or broken English. Along the wharves, traders laid out their goods, bright beads, iron tools, woven cloth, and kettles, all ready to be exchanged with native neighbors who came in canoes heavy with furs. The fur trade was the lifeblood of the colony. Beaver pelts, smooth and water-resistant, were prized above all. In the forests and rivers of the Hudson Valley, the Lenape, the Mohawken, and the Mohawk hunted and trapped, their canoes gliding through reeds and rapids, carrying bundles of pelts to the Dutch forts. Each pelt passed into the hands of the traders, who carefully stacked them in warehouses near Fort Amsterdam. From there, they were shipped across the ocean, destined to be transformed into the felt hats that were the height of European fashion. A single bundle of furs might fetch a fortune in Amsterdam's markets, and so the colony thrived. But it was not only trade that filled New Netherland with life. Farmers cleared the forests of Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Staten Island, their fields lined with rows of wheat, corn, and rye. Cows and goats grazed in pastures, and orchards blossomed in the spring, their petals drifting like snow. Windmills turned slowly on the breeze, grinding grain into flour, their sails creaking as though speaking in the old tongue of Holland. New Amsterdam itself grew busier, narrow streets were laid out, winding in uneven lines, their names still echoing in today's city. Breedweg, or Broadway, stretched northward like a crooked path through the settlement. De Valstraat, or Wall Street, marked the place where a protective palisade once stood, guarding the town against any who might threaten it. Along Pearl Street, shops and taverns opened their doors, filled with the laughter of sailors and the scent of tobacco smoke. What made the colony unique was its diversity. While other colonies in the New World clung to a single language or faith, New Netherland welcomed many. Dutch settlers lived beside Walloon families, French Huguenots, English wanderers, German artisans, Jews seeking refuge, and Africans, both free and enslaved. More than a dozen languages could be heard in its streets. It was said that in New Amsterdam one might hear the chatter of children in Dutch, the songs of Africans carried on the wind, the prayers of Jews in quiet houses, and the words of native traders bartering at the docks all within the same day. The colony's leaders encouraged tolerance, not always from generosity but from practicality. To thrive in such a place, the people had to find ways to live together, to trade, to farm, to build. And so, while quarrels arose and tempers sometimes flared, New Netherland became a place unlike any other in the New World, a mosaic of cultures, stitched together by necessity and hope. At its peak, the colony stretched beyond Manhattan. Fort Orange, far upriver, anchored the trade of the Hudson Valley. Settlements took root in Long Island and across the river in New Jersey. On Staten Island, farms grew. On the Delaware, outposts watched over fertile valleys, though small in number compared to the sprawling English colonies. The Dutch had carved a strong foothold, their banners fluttering proudly above their forts, and yet shadows always lingered. Relations with native neighbors could shift suddenly, as trade disputes, broken promises, or misunderstandings led to conflict. At times, wars flared, the most terrible of which was Kieft's War in the 1640s, when blood stained the soil and trust was torn apart. Even within the colony, quarrels arose: farmers against traders, settlers against governors, neighbors against neighbors. Still, New Amsterdam endured, carried forward by the rhythm of trade, the labor of farmers, the prayers of families, and the laughter of children. On summer evenings, lanterns glowed in the windows, casting golden light upon the narrow lanes. Tavern doors swung open, spilling out music and merriment. Across the harbor, the forests lay dark and silent, but within the little town, there was warmth, noise, and life. For a brief season of years, it seemed the Dutch colony might last forever, its people building a new Holland across the sea. Yet history was already shifting, as empires measured and weighed each other's strength. To the north and south, the English colonies grew ever larger, their eyes glancing toward the Hudson, that noble river, and the harbor that opened to the world. But for now, before the fleets arrived, before the banners were lowered, New Amsterdam lived at its peak. A place of many voices, of bustling docks, of windmills turning against the sky. A town that would one day be called New York, but which in these years was simply New Amsterdam, proud, diverse, and alive. And so, under the stars and the turning sails of its mills, the Dutch colony dreamed of permanence, never knowing that change already waited just beyond the horizon. The seizure of New Amsterdam, the summer of 1664, was warm upon the harbor. The waters of the Hudson gleamed in the sunlight, and the wind carried the scent of pine from the forests of Long Island. In New Amsterdam, life bustled much as it always had. Merchants shouted at the docks, children chased one another down narrow lanes, and the sails of trading ships swelled against the sky. The colony, diverse and lively, seemed as permanent as the tides themselves. Yet beyond the horizon, sails had already risen, English sails, white against the blue. For, though the Dutch had built their small city with care, the English, who ruled the neighboring colonies to the north and south, had long envied its harbor. New Amsterdam lay at the heart of the coast, a jewel of trade, a port that commanded the river valleys leading deep into the continent. And so, the English crown cast its gaze upon the Dutch possession and decided it must be theirs. In August of that year, 4 English warships sailed into the bay. Their decks bristled with cannon, their flags snapping in the breeze. They anchored just beyond the fort, their guns trained upon the little town. The settlers of New Amsterdam gathered in fear, staring out at the ships. Some whispered that resistance was possible, others, more practical, saw at once that it was not. At the head of the colony stood Governor Peter Stuyvesant, a man of stern will and iron faith. He had ruled for years with a wooden leg bound in silver, his temper sharp as a blade. When word reached him that the English demanded surrender, he stamped his wooden leg upon the floor and declared that he would rather fight. He swore he would defend the town with fire and blood, that no Englishman would seize it while he lived. But the people of New Amsterdam thought otherwise. They were merchants, farmers, artisans, men and women who had built homes, planted orchards, raised children. They knew the strength of the English fleet, the thunder of its cannon, the weakness of their own defenses. To resist would mean ruin, the burning of their homes, perhaps the slaughter of their families. So they pleaded with Stuyvesant. They begged him to yield, to spare the town. Women gathered with their children, crying out that they would not see their lives destroyed for pride. Merchants pressed upon him, declaring that trade and livelihood mattered more than war. Even his own council urged surrender. At last, Stuyvesant, his face lined with fury and sorrow, relented. He tore the letter of demand in anger, but his strength was broken. The decision was no longer his. And so, without a single cannon fired, without a single musket raised, New Amsterdam passed from Dutch to English hands. The flags of Holland were lowered from Fort Amsterdam, and the banners of St. George were raised in their place. The harbor echoed with English voices, the soldiers stepping ashore to take possession of their prize. The town did not burn, the houses stood, the fields lay golden with ripening grain, the children still played in the lanes. Yet everything had changed. The colony was no longer New Netherland, it was now New York, named for the Duke of York, brother of King Charles II, who had granted the conquest. The city's streets bore the same names, its people spoke the same tongues. But beneath it all, a new rule had begun. Some settlers rejoiced, for trade with the English promised new prosperity. Others mourned, feeling that something precious had been lost. A tie to the homeland across the sea, to the merchants and guilds of Amsterdam. The Africans who labored in bondage, the native peoples who watched from the forests, they too saw the change. Though for them, the face of power mattered less than the weight of its hand. As for Stuyvesant, the stubborn old governor, he lived out his days quietly upon his farm in the village that would one day bear his name. No longer master of the colony, he walked among orchards and fields, a man who had once held the fate of a city in his hands, now at peace with the land itself. Thus, with scarcely a shot fired, New Amsterdam became New York. The Dutch years, brief, though bright, slipped into memory, leaving behind their mark in names, in streets, in the mingled blood of its people. The English now held the harbor, the river, the city. A new chapter of history had opened, and though the town looked much the same as it had before, the future would now flow along a different course. For empires do not always conquer with fire. Sometimes, they conquer with sails, with patience, and with the simple weight of power. And so it was, on a warm summer's day in 1664, that New Amsterdam ceased to be, and New York was born. A growing port city, the harbor of New York, in the years after 1664, shimmered like a mirror of opportunity. Each dawn, when the first light touched the water, sails appeared on the horizon, broad Dutch flights, still bringing cargo, English brigs heavy with goods, and French and Spanish ships daring the risks of trade. The port had become a gathering place for the world's merchants, and in its streets the sound of many tongues echoed, as if the very earth had learned to speak in chorus. The English governors who replaced the Dutch did not strip the town of its character. Instead, they nurtured it as a growing child. They saw what the Dutch had built: houses neat with gables, a market square, alive with barter, and a fort standing proud above the bay, and they decided it could be made greater still. The Duke of York had no wish for the city to be a frontier village. He wanted a jewel upon the coast, a gateway to the riches of the New World, and so, the harbor became the heartbeat of the city. Each tide brought ships groaning with cargo, sugar from the Caribbean, furs from the forests, timber from New England, molasses, salt fish, and wine. In return, New York sent out flour from its mills, meat from its pastures, and above all, wheat and grain. For the fields along the Hudson were rich and generous. Day by day, the wharves grew longer. Wooden piers thrust out into the bay, where sailors hauled barrels and crates onto the planks, shouting in accents that mingled London with Rotterdam, Africa with Ireland, the smell of tar and salt, of oak barrels filled with rum, of spices drifting from cargo holds. This was the perfume of the city's growth. The streets bustled more than ever. Taverns filled with sailors who spoke tales of storms, of sea battles, of hidden coves where pirates lurked. Markets swelled with goods from every shore, so that a housewife in New York might buy Dutch cheeses, English cloth, and Caribbean sugar in the same morning. Children darted between stalls, laughing as they clutched apples or sweetmeats, while merchants argued in a dozen languages over the price of goods. Yet beneath the hum of trade, shadows stirred, for not all who came to the harbor came freely. The ships that anchored in the bay did not carry only barrels and crates. Some bore chains, from Africa, across the terrible Middle Passage. Men and women were brought, their lives stolen, their bodies sold into bondage. New York, like other ports of empire, was built upon their labor as much as upon trade. On the docks, auctions were held in the open sun, and buyers haggled over human lives as they would over wheat or cattle. The enslaved cleared forests, built houses, and labored in the fields along the Hudson. They dug the stones for streets, raised the walls of churches, and worked in the kitchens of the wealthy. Their songs, heavy with sorrow and memory, drifted across the city's nights, blending with the creak of masts and the cry of gulls. Though their names were seldom written in the records, their sweat and their suffering became part of the mortar of New York itself. Still, the city grew. By the turn of the century, it had swelled far beyond the little Dutch town it once had been. Wooden houses lined crooked streets, windmills turned lazily in the breezes. Churches rose with steeples pointing to the sky. English law governed, but Dutch customs lingered, and so too did the traces of Africa, of the native peoples, of all who had walked those shores. New York was becoming not one nation's city, but a city of the world. Travelers marveled at it. They spoke of how the harbor, when viewed at sunset, glowed with the lights of ships, their lanterns bobbing like stars upon the water. They told of the mingling of faiths and tongues, Anglicans, Dutch, Reformed, Lutherans, Jews, and Quakers, all in a place where trade seemed to matter more than creed. They spoke of the restless energy of its people, who dreamed not only of survival but of prosperity, of wealth, of lives greater than those of their fathers. And so, as the 17th century slipped into the 18th, New York was no longer a small colonial outpost. It was a harbor whose sails stretched across oceans, a city whose streets held the murmur of many worlds. It stood not yet as the greatest of ports, not yet as the beating heart of a nation, but already the air above it seemed filled with possibility, as if the very gulls circling overhead carried whispers of the city's future greatness. For a city, like a child, carries within it the seed of what it will become, and in the creaking of the masts, in the footsteps of sailors on the docks, in the cries of enslaved workers lifting stones, in the laughter of children in crooked streets, there could be heard the faint stirring of destiny. Thus New York, still young, still fragile, grew strong upon its harbor, and the tides that carried ships into its bay seemed also to carry the city itself toward a future larger than any of its people could yet imagine. A city of many peoples. When the English flag rose above the fort in 1664, New Amsterdam was renamed New York, yet the spirit of the Dutch did not vanish with a word. Their brick houses with gabled roofs still leaned over narrow lanes. Their markets still bustled with cheeses and beer, and their voices, carrying the lilting sounds of Holland, still echoed in taverns and churchyards. The English, pragmatic and ambitious, had not come to erase the past, but to fold it into a new order. And so New York became a curious blend, not one tongue nor one custom, but many. The streets told the story best. Along the main thoroughfares, English merchants strutted in their coats of wool, powdered wigs upon their heads, while Dutch traders kept their plainer dress, proud of their thrift. African men, some free but most enslaved, hauled barrels on their backs, their muscles straining as they carried the goods of others. Women from every land walked the lanes, Dutch wives carrying baskets of bread, English mothers shepherding children, native women selling corn and berries, and African women balancing water or firewood upon their heads. Listen closely, and you would hear a symphony of voices. Dutch blended with English, French mingled with Irish, German overlapped with the words of the Lenape. On the docks, sailors sang shanties in accents from across the seas, while in the market square, bargaining leaped from one tongue to another, as though language itself was just another tool of trade. Religions, too, mingled in this small city. The Dutch Reformed Church stood solid and proud, but nearby rose Anglican churches, Lutheran meeting houses, and even the modest synagogue of Jewish settlers, one of the earliest in North America. Quakers prayed quietly in their plain rooms, while Catholics, though eyed with suspicion by English governors, whispered their prayers in hidden corners. In New York, faith was less a matter of unity than of coexistence, each group carving out its own space in the patchwork of belief. Daily life unfolded in rhythms both ordinary and extraordinary. At dawn, the smell of baking bread drifted from Dutch kitchens, mingling with the sharp scent of salted fish hung to dry. Farmers' carts creaked into town from the countryside, piled high with vegetables, hay, and milk. Children ran barefoot through the lanes, dodging chickens and pigs that wandered freely, their laughter ringing louder than the bells that marked the hours. By midday, the markets hummed. Women haggled over cheese wheels and bolts of cloth, while butchers swung their cleavers with a thud, and sailors leaned on barrels of rum, trading gossip from distant seas. Taverns filled with chatter stories of pirates off the coast, of wars in Europe, of fortunes made and lost in the Caribbean sugar trade. Yet life in New York was not all merriment and ease. Enslaved Africans lived under constant labor and threat, their bodies considered property by law. They dug ditches, built walls, tended livestock, and toiled in households, their days long and their nights short. In whispers, they told one another stories from their homelands, clinging to fragments of song and memory. These hidden threads of African culture, though suppressed, wove themselves into the life of the city in music, cooking, and quiet resilience. Festivals and gatherings brightened the year. On Shrove Tuesday, before the Lenten fast, the streets echoed with merrymaking, masks, and laughter, a tradition carried over from Dutch days. At Christmas, English customs filled the air with carols and feasting. Harvest time brought fairs where cider flowed, fiddles sang, and men and women danced upon the green. For in a city of many peoples, joy was one language that required no translation. The landscape of the city changed as quickly as its people. Wooden houses rose along crooked lanes. Gardens bloomed behind fences, and windmills creaked slowly in the breezes, grinding the grain that filled the city's markets. By the early 1700s, Brick buildings appeared, sturdier and taller, a mark of prosperity. The streets themselves were often muddy and cluttered, yet to those who walked them, they seemed alive with promise. Travelers passing through remarked on the city's curious mixture. They spoke of its diversity, greater than that of Boston or Philadelphia. They noted its openness to trade, where a Dutch merchant might strike a bargain with a Jew, or an Englishman drink alongside a Scot, an African, or a sailor from Spain. They marveled at its energy, its restlessness, as though New York was always leaning forward, always hungering for the next tide, the next ship, the next chance at fortune. And in the quiet hours, when the city's bustle grew still, the many voices of its people lingered like echoes in the night. The creak of a cartwheel, the murmur of a prayer in Dutch, the hum of an African lullaby, the faint sound of English song drifting from a tavern window, all these wove together into the fabric of the city's soul. New York was not yet great, not yet the giant it would become, but in its streets and harbors, its markets and homes, the seed of greatness was sown not from the power of one people, but from the mingling of many. For this was a city born not of sameness, but of difference, and it was that very difference that gave it life. Thus, in the years before Revolution, stirred the colonies New York, already stood apart a city of many peoples, many tongues, and many dreams, bound together by the tides that lapped against its harbor, and the restless hope that tomorrow might be brighter than today. Shadows of slavery, the city of New York, with its busy harbor and crowded markets, often seemed a place of endless promise. Ships came and went like clockwork, carrying goods and people from distant lands. Merchants counted their profits, children played in crooked lanes, and taverns rang with laughter. But beneath this lively rhythm lay a darker beat, one that throbbed quietly yet powerfully, the rhythm of slavery. From the earliest days of Dutch New Amsterdam, enslaved Africans had been brought across the ocean in chains. The Dutch West India Company, eager for labor, had shipped them to the colony to clear forests, build houses, and tend fields. When the English took control in 1664, they did not end this practice. Instead, they expanded it, weaving bondage into the very fabric of New York's growth. Walk along the wharves in the early 1700s, and you would see it plainly. Ships from the Caribbean unloaded barrels of sugar and molasses, but also weary, shackled men and women whose names were never recorded. Auction blocks stood in open squares, where buyers examined human beings as though they were cattle. Prices were shouted, hands were raised, and lives were sold in moments, as if they weighed no more than the flour that filled the city's mills. The enslaved labored everywhere. They hauled stone to pave the streets, raised the walls of churches, and built the wooden docks that welcomed ships. In kitchens, they stirred pots of stew and baked bread for masters' tables. In fields beyond the city, they tended crops from dawn until dusk, their backs bent, their hands roughened. Some worked as skilled artisans, carpenters, coopers, and blacksmiths. Yet the wages they earned went not into their own pockets, but into those of their owners. At night, when their labor ended, they returned to cramped quarters, cellars beneath houses, huts at the edge of town, or simple wooden shacks on estates. Yet even there, they carried with them fragments of home, songs whispered in African tongues, stories of ancestors told by firelight, quiet prayers lifted to gods of both Africa and the New World. These fragments gave strength, a reminder that though chains bound their bodies, their spirits were not so easily broken. Still, life was harsh. Punishments were severe, laws unforgiving. Enslaved people were forbidden to gather in large groups, to carry weapons, to travel without written permission. Fear of rebellion haunted the city's rulers, and their answer was often cruelty. In 1712, such fear burst into violence, when enslaved Africans, desperate for freedom, set fire to buildings and struck back against their oppressors. The revolt was quickly crushed, and the punishment was brutal: men and women executed in the public square, their bodies left as a warning. Yet even such horrors did not erase resistance. In secret, enslaved New Yorkers carved out spaces of dignity. They created families, though the law did not honor their bonds. They gathered in the shadows to dance and sing, the rhythms of drums echoing against the night, carrying memories across oceans. They labored, but they also endured, and in their endurance they left marks upon the city's soul, marks of resilience, of culture, of humanity unbroken. New York's prosperity rested upon their toil. The grand houses of wealthy merchants, the bustling markets, the very streets that guided wagons and horses, all bore the hidden fingerprints of enslaved labor. Even Wall Street, that future center of finance, had once been lined with slave markets. The city's wealth was built upon sorrow, a truth often forgotten in the clamor of trade and ambition. Travelers noted the contradiction. They marveled at the city's diversity, its energy, its growing importance, yet they also saw the cruelty of men bought and sold like goods. Some turned away, unwilling to dwell upon it. Others wrote of it in letters and journals, their words faint protests against an order that seemed immovable. And so, while New York grew, so too did its shadows. Behind the laughter of taverns, the hum of markets, and the creak of ships at the wharf, there were quieter sounds: the clink of chains, the weeping of mothers separated from children, the sighs of men dreaming of freedom they might never taste. The city was a place of many peoples, yes, but not all lived by choice. Its greatness, like a grand building, was raised on foundations of stone and wood, but also on the backs of the enslaved, whose names are lost to time, though their labor shaped every street. And yet, within those shadows, a spark remained. The yearning for liberty, the whisper of rebellion, the hope that one day chains would fall away. It was a dream carried in hearts through the darkest of nights, a dream that would echo forward, long after the century turned, long after the revolution came. For New York, like all cities, carried both light and shadow, and in its story, the shadows of slavery remind us that its beauty was not without sorrow, and its promise not without pain. A city on edge. The year was the mid-1770s, and New York, once a busy but quiet colonial port, had grown restless. Its harbor still brimmed with sails, its markets still bustled with trade. But beneath the hum of daily life there was unease, like the low rumble of thunder far beyond the hills. For across the colonies, discontent with Britain was rising, and New York, ever a crossroads of people and ideas, could not escape the storm. In taverns along the waterfront, where sailors gathered to drink and merchants haggled late into the night, arguments flared more often than laughter. One man would pound the table, declaring that taxation without representation was tyranny. Another would shout back that loyalty to the king was the surest path to peace and prosperity. Voices clashed, mugs spilled, and sometimes fists flew, for the city itself was divided, half leaning toward rebellion, half clinging to Britain's crown. Walk its streets, and you would feel the tension. Posters nailed to wooden posts called meetings of the Sons of Liberty, urging citizens to resist unjust taxes. In marketplaces, whispers spread of boycotts: no British tea, no British cloth. Meanwhile, loyalist families hung the Union Jack from their windows, a quiet defiance against their fiery neighbors. Children, too young to understand the weight of it all, quarreled in place, some shouting "Long live the King," while others answered with "Liberty forever." Ships brought news from Boston, where protests had turned to violence, and from Philadelphia, where talk of unity among the colonies was growing stronger. Each new tidbit of news was carried through the city like sparks through dry straw, igniting fears and hopes alike. The air was thick with rumors of battles already fought, of secret plots, of war that might come tomorrow or might never come at all. For New York was not like Boston, burning hot with rebellion, nor like some southern towns, loyal and quiet. New York was both. Its merchants prospered under British trade and feared losing it. Its radicals, bold and fiery, dreamed of freedom. Its enslaved population, bound in silence, listened and wondered if this talk of liberty might ever reach them. The city was a tapestry of loyalties, each thread pulling in a different direction. By night, secret meetings gathered in candlelit rooms. Men spoke in hushed voices of militias, of smuggling arms, of writing petitions. George Washington's name was whispered, his figure already casting a shadow larger than life. Yet outside, British soldiers still walked the streets, their red coats bright against the dark wooden houses, their presence a reminder that rebellion would not come without cost. Even the churches echoed with division. Some ministers prayed for the king, asking God's blessing upon him. Others thundered from their pulpits that freedom was a sacred right, and that tyranny must be resisted. Congregations sat uneasily in their pews, half nodding, half frowning, neighbors divided by words that cut as deep as blades. For ordinary folk, the unease slipped into daily life. Housewives wondered whether prices would rise, or whether ships would stop coming altogether. Farmers hesitated before hauling their produce into town, fearful of unrest. Craftsmen debated whether to supply the British Army or the colonial militias. Nothing felt steady, as though the very cobblestones of the streets had begun to shift beneath their feet. And yet, for all the tension, life went on. Children still played in the alleys, markets still rang with haggling, couples still wed, and bells still tolled on Sundays. But behind every smile, behind every ordinary gesture, there lurked the knowledge that change was coming, slow but sure, like a tide that could not be held back. Travelers passing through New York in those years often remarked upon this sense of balance of a city poised upon a knife's edge. They wrote of the nervous energy in the air, of the strange mix of fear and excitement. Some predicted that New York would never rebel, so strong were its ties to Britain. Others felt certain that when the moment came, the city would burn with the same fire as Boston. And so, New York in those years was a city caught between two worlds. On one side, loyalty, order, tradition, the weight of the crown. On the other, rebellion, liberty, the dream of something new. The people walked daily between these poles, their hearts tugged this way and that, never certain where they would stand when the final call came. It was a fragile peace, a calm before the storm. But storms, as the sailors in the harbor well knew, do not stay on the horizon forever. The Battle of Long Island, the summer of 1776, was heavy with heat, and heavier still with expectation. Only weeks before, in Philadelphia, bold voices had declared independence. Words written on parchment had crossed oceans and centuries, words that claimed liberty as a birthright and shook the very throne of Britain. Those words echoed now in New York, but they were not the only sounds in the air. For across the harbor, sails crowded the waters, white and endless as a forest of ghosts. The British had come. They came in numbers so vast that even seasoned sailors marveled. Ships stretched from horizon to horizon, their masts like spears thrust into the sky. Red-coated soldiers poured ashore, their drums and fifes sharp against the summer air. With them marched Hessian mercenaries, hardened men from German lands, their boots thudding like thunder on the earth. It was the largest force Britain had ever sent across the sea, and it had come for one purpose: to crush the rebellion before it grew too strong. General George Washington, tall and solemn, watched from Manhattan as the enemy gathered. He had brought his army north from Boston, ragged though it was, and set it to work digging trenches, building fortifications, and preparing for what all knew must come. His men were farmers, tradesmen, boys scarcely grown, their muskets worn and their powder scarce. Yet their spirits burned with the new fire of independence, a fire that Washington sought to steady, lest it flare too wildly or sputter out. The battle came at last in late August, upon the green fields and wooded hills of Long Island. At dawn, mist clung to the ground as the armies faced one another. The British advanced with precision, their lines gleaming in the rising sun. Washington's men held fast, their hearts pounding, their breath sharp in their chests. Muskets cracked, cannon roared, and the air filled with smoke and cries. At first, the patriots fought bravely. They stood in their trenches, fired from behind trees, and pushed back charge after charge. But the British were cunning. While one force attacked from the front, another circled wide, slipping unseen through wooded passes. Suddenly, Washington's men found themselves struck from behind, their lines broken, their defenses shattered. Confusion swept the field. Soldiers ran, some into the marshes where they drowned, others into the forests where they were cut down. The cries of the wounded rose above the clash, a chorus of agony. It was the first great test of the young Continental Army, and it ended in defeat. Long Island belonged to the British. New York lay open before them. Yet even in defeat there was courage. Washington.com, amid chaos, worked through the night to save what he could. With the British closing in, he ordered a retreat across the East River. In darkness, under the cover of fog, his men rowed silently in small boats, carrying soldiers, horses, and cannons alike. When dawn broke, the fog lingered just long enough to hide the last boats as they slipped away. By miracle, or by providence, the army was saved. The people of New York watched with mixed hearts. Loyalists welcomed the British as protectors, hanging lanterns in their windows and offering wine to the officers. Patriots wept, their hopes dimmed, their city lost. Enslaved men and women saw in the British a chance for freedom, for rumors spread that any who fled their rebel masters would find liberty beneath the Union Jack. Families were torn apart, loyalties divided, and the city became a place of occupation. The Battle of Long Island was not the end of the war, but its lesson was clear. Freedom would not come easily. The road ahead would be long and bloody, filled with setbacks as well as triumphs. Yet Washington's retreat kept the dream alive. Though beaten, his army lived to fight again. Though New York was lost, the cause was not. Travelers who later told the tale spoke often of that fog, rolling thick upon the river as boats slipped silently across. They called it chance, or luck, or the hand of God. For had the fog lifted sooner, had the British seen the retreat, the rebellion might have ended in those early days. But history, like the tide, turned in Washington's favor, if only for a moment. And so, New York fell into British hands, a city under redcoats and bayonets. Yet in the hearts of those who dreamed of liberty, the flame still flickered. Beaten, bloodied, but unextinguished, it glowed in the darkness, waiting for the day it would burn bright once more. Occupied by the British, after the smoke of Long Island cleared and Washington's army slipped away into the fog, New York belonged to the British. The Union Jack fluttered from the ramparts of the fort at the tip of Manhattan, and red-coated soldiers filled the streets. What had been a restless city of debate and division now became the greatest military base in North America, a jewel in the crown of King George's empire. For nearly 7 long years, the British occupied New York. Their ships crowded the harbor, black holes bobbing like dark teeth against the water. Their drums and fifes rang down the lanes, their boots pounded the cobblestones, and their cannons watched silently from the forts. The city was no longer merely a port of trade. It was an armed camp, a place of barracks, prisons, and military orders shouted at dawn. Life for the people of New York changed swiftly. Loyalists, those who supported the king, welcomed the occupation. They hung flags from their homes, sold goods to the army, and filled their tables with British officers who paid in gold. Many prospered, for war is often cruelly generous to those who stand on the stronger side. But for patriots, those who had cheered for liberty, the city became a place of shadows and silence. Some fled before the British entered, abandoning homes and shops to seek safety in the countryside. Others stayed, keeping their voices low, their hopes hidden, while spies carried secret messages in the folds of skirts or tucked inside barrels of flour. The price of discovery was imprisonment or worse. For prisoners, New York was a place of misery. The British turned ships anchored in the harbor into floating prisons, where captured rebels lay crammed in the dark, without food, without clean air. Thousands perished there, their bodies carried ashore to shallow graves. On land, makeshift prisons overflowed, the air heavy with disease. The city gained a grim reputation, for more Americans would die in captivity here than in battlefields across the war. The Great Fire of 1776 scarred the city further. Flames tore through lower Manhattan one September night, devouring homes and churches, leaving blackened ruins behind. Some said it was the Patriots who set it, hoping to deny the British a comfortable base. Others said it was chance, or carelessness. Whatever the cause, the fire left a third of the city in ashes, its people homeless, its skyline broken, and amid the ruins, soldiers marched on, unmoved by the suffering of civilians. Yet even in those dark years, life did not wholly wither. Taverns still served ale, markets still opened, and children still played in narrow alleys. Weddings were held, births celebrated, and laughter, though quieter, still found its way into corners of the city. Human hearts, like embers, glowed even when the wind of war blew cold. The enslaved found the occupation both peril and promise. For the British, seeking to weaken the rebellion, offered freedom to any enslaved who fled rebel masters and joined their cause. Many seized this chance, slipping through the city gates at night or finding passage to British ships. Some worked for the army as laborers or guides, some even bore arms. Others were betrayed, returned to bondage, or left adrift when the British withdrew. Yet in those years, the dream of liberty took root in many hearts, spreading quietly alongside the greater cause of American independence, and all the while, beyond the city's walls, the war raged on. Washington's army struck, retreated, endured harsh winters, and rose again. While New York remained the Redcoats' stronghold, Loyalist families grew comfortable, patriots grew weary, and the city itself seemed caught in a long twilight, neither at peace nor fully aflame, but suspended between. Travelers described New York under occupation as both lively and grim. Its harbor bustled more than ever with ships, yet its streets carried the shadows of prisons and ruins. Grand balls and dances lit the nights for British officers, while whispers of suffering spread through the alleys. It was a city divided by loyalty, by fortune, by fate. And so, the years passed. The war turned slowly against Britain, battles won far away, shifting the tide. Yet in New York, the king's flag still waved, and the people lived day by day beneath its shadow, waiting for the moment when history's wheel would turn again. For a city under occupation is like a heart held in another's hand. It beats, but not freely. And though New York endured, though it adapted and survived, it waited always for release, for the day when its streets would ring, not with foreign drums, but with the footsteps of its own once more. Victory and liberation. The war stretched on like a long and restless night. For nearly 7 years, New York remained beneath the shadow of British power, its harbor guarded by warships, its streets echoing with foreign drums. Yet far beyond its walls, the tide of battle slowly shifted. In the fields of the South, and in the valleys of Virginia, the king's armies faltered. The dream of independence, though battered, still lived. And in the autumn of 1781, it blazed into triumph at Yorktown, where General Cornwallis surrendered to George Washington. The news traveled slowly to New York, carried on whispers and letters, on the weary footsteps of messengers. At first, many doubted it, for the city seemed unchanged, coats still patrolled, ships still lay in the harbor, loyalists still held their dinners and dances. But truth has a way of breaking through. The war was lost. Britain would make peace. And though it would take 2 more long years, everyone in New York knew the end was coming. For the Loyalists, the news fell heavy as iron. Those who had feasted in the officers' halls, who had prospered selling to the army, who had cheered the king's cause, what would become of them when the Patriots returned? Some hurriedly sold their homes, their shops, their belongings, and booked passage on ships bound for Canada, the Caribbean, or back to England itself. Others stayed, clinging to hope that they might yet live in peace, though suspicion would follow them like a shadow. For the enslaved who had fled to the British lines, fear and hope mingled bitterly. Many had been promised freedom for their loyalty, and some were indeed granted passage out of New York, bound for Nova Scotia or other British lands. Others, cruelly, were betrayed, returned to bondage by the shifting compromises of treaties. Freedom had been glimpsed, touched, and for some lost again. Yet the memory of it, like a spark, lingered and spread. For the Patriots, though, the waiting was almost unbearable. They had endured exile from their city, separation from their homes. Some had fled in 1776 and had not returned for 7 years. Their thoughts often drifted back to the narrow streets of Manhattan. 2 shops shuttered and gardens overgrown, 2 churches scarred by fire, 2 the waters of the Hudson and East Rivers glimmering in the sun. Now at last they dreamed of walking those streets again under their own flag. The final moment came in November of 1783. It was called the evacuation, the day the British troops departed New York at last. The harbor swelled with ships, their sails catching the wind, their decks crowded with soldiers, families, and loyalists leaving forever. Cannon fire marked their departure, echoing across the waters. The king's banners were lowered, and slowly, the sound of British drums faded into the distance. And then, into the silence, came the Americans. George Washington himself entered the city, riding at the head of his soldiers. It was a gray day, with winter drawing near, yet the air was bright with joy. Crowds gathered along the streets, cheering, waving, weeping. Flags of the new nation fluttered from windows and rooftops. After 7 years of occupation, after years of silence and fear, New York's heart beat freely again. It was said that as Washington passed down Broadway, a child climbed a lamppost to watch him, eyes wide with wonder. Shopkeepers threw open their shutters, church bells rang, and old friends embraced in the streets. For the first time, the city belonged to the United States, not to king nor crown. The years of war had left scars. Homes lay in ruins, churches blackened by fire, families scattered. The prisons and ships had taken thousands of lives. The bitterness between neighbor and neighbor, patriot and loyalist, would not vanish quickly. Yet beneath the grief, there was pride, and hope, and the quiet certainty that a new chapter had begun. Washington himself felt the weight of it. He knew the city was more than stone and timber, more than ships and trade. It was a symbol. For here, in this place where liberty had once seemed to vanish in smoke and chains, it had returned. The revolution was not only won in fields of battle, it was also won in the survival of cities like New York, enduring, waiting, and finally rising again. And so, as dusk fell on that November day, the people of New York lit candles in their windows. The glow shone softly along the streets, flickering against the walls of homes and taverns, churches and halls. It was not the light of bonfires or fireworks, but something gentler, something steadier, the light of hope, of freedom reclaimed. New York was free. The war was over. The night had passed, and though the dawn was uncertain, it was theirs. The nation's first capital of the year was 1783, and New York was free at last. The Union Jack was gone from its flagpoles, the redcoats had sailed from its harbor, and George Washington had ridden in triumph through its cheering streets. But though peace had returned, the city bore the marks of its long captivity. Many of its homes still lay in ruins from the fire of 1776. Churches had been scarred by flames, their steeples charred, their bells melted or stolen. Gardens were overgrown, fences broken, and warehouses stood empty. The people who had fled during the occupation were only just returning, finding their neighborhoods changed, their neighbors altered by war. Some loyalists had vanished forever, bound for Canada or England. Others remained silent, careful, wary of old resentments. Yet despite these scars, New York stirred again like a city waking from a restless sleep. Its harbor, always its greatest strength, filled once more with ships. Merchants returned to their counting houses, sailors to their docks, farmers to their stalls. The markets grew noisy, the taverns alive with chatter, the cobblestones crowded. There was hardship, yes, but there was also the pulse of rebirth. For trade was flowing again, and opportunity followed closely behind. And beyond all of this, a greater honor was stirring, for New York was chosen to serve as the first capital of the United States. The young nation was fragile, like a vessel just set afloat. The states were bound together by the newly written Constitution, but their unity was untested, their future uncertain. A seat of government was needed, a place where leaders might gather to shape the republic's beginning. And so, in 1789, the eyes of the nation turned toward New York. The city prepared itself with care, though it was still rough about the edges. Streets were swept, buildings repaired, and balconies festooned with flags and garlands. The old City Hall on Wall Street was refitted into a grand chamber worthy of a Congress, its stones cleaned, its rooms polished. It would be called Federal Hall, and within its walls, the first debates of the new government would echo, but the truest glory of those days came not from stone or timber, but from a man. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington stood upon the balcony of Federal Hall to take the oath as the first president of the United States. The crowd pressed below, holding its breath, as the tall figure placed his hand upon the Bible and swore to uphold the Constitution. When the words were spoken, a roar rose up from the streets, cannons boomed from the harbor, and church bells rang in wild joy. Those who were present never forgot it. They remembered Washington's steady voice, his solemn dignity, his modest bow, as the people cheered. Some said tears glistened in his eyes, for he felt the weight of history upon his shoulders. This was no coronation, no crowning of a king, it was the birth of something new. A nation built not upon crowns and bloodlines, but upon the will of its people. For a brief time, New York became the beating heart of the Republic. Congress met at Federal Hall, hammering out the laws of the young nation. The first cabinet gathered there, men whose names would echo through history: Jefferson, Hamilton, Knox, and others. Diplomats from foreign lands walked its streets, marveling at this new experiment in liberty. Taverns buzzed with talk of politics, pamphlets flew from printing presses, and citizens filled galleries to listen to debates. The city was alive with energy, a mixture of pride and uncertainty. For while it stood as capital, New York was also still a city of merchants and sailors, of markets and ships. The smell of tar and fish still clung to its docks, and carts still rattled through its lanes. It was a place of grand ideas and humble labors, of statesmen and powdered wigs and dock hands and rough coats, all mingling beneath the same sky. Washington himself walked its streets with quiet humility. He attended services at St. Paul's Chapel, where his pew can still be seen today. He dined with merchants, visited friends, and strolled through gardens. Wherever he went, people gathered to watch, some in reverence, others in curiosity. For too many he seemed almost larger than life. Yet he bore the gaze of the people with patience, never seeking grandeur, but always offering steadiness. In those months, New York was not merely a city. It was a symbol of the new republic itself, scarred yet standing, flawed yet hopeful, striving to build a future from the ruins of the past. The memory of war still lingered in its stones, but the promise of peace shone in its flags. And though the capital would not remain there long, soon to move to Philadelphia, and later to the banks of the Potomac, those years would never be forgotten. For in the spring of 1789, under candlelight and sky, amid ships and steeples, New York was the place where America truly began to breathe as a nation. The city that had once been occupied, humbled, and scarred now stood at the very center of history, its streets echoing with the first steps of liberty's long march. A city of trade and growth. When the honor of serving as the nation's capital passed from New York to Philadelphia in 1790, the city did not fade into quiet. Instead, it stirred with new energy, as if relieved to turn from politics to its truest strength, commerce. For New York was a harbor first and foremost, a place where the rivers of the land met the wide ocean, and where ships carried not only goods, but ideas, stories, and hope. Each dawn, the harbor woke before the sun. Masts swayed like a forest of wooden spears, sails flapped in the morning breeze, and the calls of sailors rose above the gulls. From distant shores they came, ships heavy with tea from China, sugar and rum from the Caribbean, silks from India, wines from France, and coffee from Brazil. Into the warehouses of Manhattan, these treasures were carried, their scents mingling in the salty air, spices sharp, fruits sweet, coffee rich and bitter. And from New York's own land and hinterlands flowed wheat, lumber, furs, and salted fish, loaded aboard to be carried to other nations. It was a rhythm as old as the sea itself. Yet in these years after the Revolution, it took on a new urgency. For America was young, hungry for recognition, and New York was becoming its proudest port. Merchants grew wealthy here, their counting houses buzzing with clerks, tallying ledgers by candlelight. They built tall, narrow homes along streets shaded by elms, their parlors filled with polished wood and imported porcelain. Banks rose to serve their fortunes, and soon Wall Street became not just a lane of shops, but the beating heart of America's finances. It was there, in 1792, that brokers signed an agreement beneath a buttonwood tree, a pact that would grow into the mighty New York Stock Exchange. What began as quiet handshakes beneath branches would one day rule the commerce of the world. Yet for all its grandeur, the city was not made only of wealth. Its docks teemed with sailors rough and weary, their songs spilling into taverns where rum flowed and fights broke out as easily as laughter. Streets bustled with carts and wagons, the cries of vendors selling bread, oysters, and apples. Chimneys smoked above small houses where artisans hammered metal, stitched leather, and carved wood. Children darted between carriages, their shouts echoing in the narrow lanes. New York was not one story, but thousands each corner, each window, each alley filled with lives unfolding. It was also a city of immigrants. The promise of America, whispered across oceans, drew souls from distant lands. Irish laborers, German craftsmen, French refugees, fleeing revolution, Jewish families seeking safety all found their way to New York's shores. They crowded into neighborhoods, each carrying their language, their faith, their food, their dreams. Some prospered, some struggled, but together they wove a tapestry richer than any single thread. The enslaved, too, still walked its streets, though their presence carried shadows of contradiction. New York was a city of liberty in name, yet bondage lingered in its houses and farms. Men and women of African descent labored in kitchens, fields, and workshops. Their freedom denied, though the nation spoke of independence. Over time, voices rose against this injustice, and by the early 1800s, steps toward gradual emancipation began. Still, the scars ran deep, a reminder that even in a city of growth, the promise of liberty was not yet complete. The city itself began to stretch northward. What had once been farmland above the tip of Manhattan slowly gave way to houses and streets. Bowery Lane, once a country road, grew lively with taverns and theaters. Broadway, along the city's spine, filled with carriages, shops, and promenading citizens in fine coats and gowns. By day, apprentices hurried on errands, and by night, lamplighters kindled flames that glowed like stars along the cobbles. And always, the harbor remained its soul. From the Battery, one could gaze out upon the endless water, sails dotting the horizon, each ship carrying with it the promise of fortune or the risk of ruin. 4 storms could strike, markets could falter, wars abroad could seize ships, and in a single tide, wealth could vanish. Yet still they came, merchants and sailors alike, drawn by the chance, however fragile, to prosper in this place of constant motion. Travelers who visited in those years often remarked upon New York's energy. It was not yet the largest city in America. That title still belonged to Philadelphia, but it was, many said, the busiest, the most restless, the most alive. Some found it noisy, even unruly, its markets crowded and its manners less refined than older cities. But others felt its pulse and recognized it for what it was, a city on the rise, a place destined to outgrow all rivals. And so, in the years after the Revolution, New York grew not in quiet pride, but in noisy, ceaseless motion. Ships docked, coins clinked, hammers rang, children laughed, and preachers thundered from pulpits. It was a place where yesterday's ruin gave way to tomorrow's promise, where scars of war were slowly covered by the bricks of progress. The Revolution had given New York freedom. Trade was giving it power. And beneath the creak of masts and the hum of markets, one could already hear the faint, steady rhythm of a city becoming not just a port, not just a capital of trade, but a capital of destiny. Immigration and diversity in the quiet of the early morning. Long before the sun climbed over the Atlantic, the ships would come. Their masts pierced the horizon, their sails heavy with the night's dampness, and in their holds were not only cargo but people. Families huddled together, carrying bundles of clothing and a few treasured belongings. Children pressed their faces to the railing, their eyes wide at the first sight of the harbor. To many, this place was not merely a city, it was the promise of a new life. New York had always been a city of many voices. Even in the days of New Amsterdam, Dutch mingled with English, with the songs of Africans and the words of native peoples. But now, in the years after the Revolution, the chorus grew louder and richer. Immigrants poured in, drawn by the whisper of opportunity carried across oceans. The Irish came first in steady streams, many fleeing hardship and poverty. They arrived with little more than their strength, taking up work as laborers on docks, farms, and roads. Their voices filled taverns, their songs carried through narrow alleys, and their hands built much of the city's growing bones. The Germans too came with their crafts and trades. They opened workshops of leather and wood, brewed strong beer, and farmed the land just beyond the city's edge. In their neighborhoods, the smell of sausages and the sound of fiddles filled the air. Their churches rose with tall spires, and their guilds gave structure to their lives. French refugees arrived as well, some fleeing revolution in their homeland, others escaping the turmoil in the Caribbean. They brought with them refined manners, a taste for cafes, and the glitter of European style. In salons and theaters, their accents lilted, their fashion turned heads, and their ideas sparked debates. The Jewish communities, small but determined, grew quietly, opening shops and gathering for worship. Though often outsiders in the old world, here they found a place to build lives with greater freedom, to weave their traditions into the fabric of the city. And still others came, sailors from distant ports, merchants from Asia, travelers who stayed and never left. New York's streets became a tangle of accents and faces, each corner bearing the stamp of a different people. But diversity was not without tension. Old families rooted in the city for generations sometimes looked warily upon the newcomers. Differences in religion, language, and customs stirred unease. At times, prejudice flared, and newcomers struggled against suspicion or exclusion. Yet despite the frictions, the city did not close its gates. Instead, it stretched and shifted, making room, reshaping itself again and again. For those who arrived with nothing, life could be harsh. Crowded boarding houses crammed families into single rooms. Streets in poorer wards filled with smoke and refuse. Work was hard, pay was meager, and winters bit cruelly. Yet still they came, for even hardship in New York seemed touched by possibility. A child could rise from a laborer's son to a merchant's apprentice, and from apprentice to master. A family might arrive penniless and, in time, own a shop, a house, a share in a ship. And beneath the hardships, there was something else: community. The Irish gathered in taverns, sharing news and songs from home. Germans celebrated festivals with beer and music. French émigrés hosted salons where ideas flowed as freely as wine. Each group built networks of care, holding each other up in this new world. And slowly, inevitably, the lines between them blurred, their children playing together in the streets, their languages mixing into the rough, vibrant speech of New York. The city itself reflected this blend. Churches of every faith rose within blocks of one another, their bells calling in different tongues. Market stalls brimmed with foods from across the seas: rye bread beside English pies, Caribbean spices beside Dutch cheeses. A walk down a single street was like a walk across continents, each shop window offering something strange and new. Travelers often remarked upon this. No other city in America, they said, felt so cosmopolitan, so alive with the world's presence. Philadelphia had its grandeur, Boston its proud traditions, but New York was something different, a living crossroads. It was not polished, nor orderly, but it was rich with energy, as though the whole globe had gathered upon its narrow island. Yet amid this patchwork, the voices of the enslaved and free black communities continued to shape the city too. Though gradual emancipation had begun, many still lived in bondage, their labor vital yet unacknowledged. Others who were free carved out lives as artisans, sailors, and preachers, building communities that preserved traditions and demanded recognition. Their churches rang with hymns, their gatherings echoed with resilience, and their presence reminded the city that liberty remained incomplete. And so New York grew not just in size, but in soul. Its people were no longer simply English, Dutch, or African, but a mingling of nations, faiths, and tongues. It was a city of collisions and connections, of disputes and friendships, of prejudice and acceptance. It was a place where the world's divisions met and often, though not always easily, learned to live side by side. At night, when the ships lay still and the markets fell quiet, one might wander the streets and hear from window to window a symphony of the world. Lullabies in Irish prayers, in Hebrew laughter and French songs, in German chants, in African rhythms. It was not harmony, not yet, but it was something greater. It was life, unceasing and diverse, flowing together like the rivers into the harbor. And in that restless mingling, in that ceaseless arrival of ships and souls, New York began to shape its destiny not merely as America's port, but as the world's. The Erie Canal in transformation. The night air was still over the Hudson River, and the stars shone like scattered lanterns hung high above the valley. It was the year 1825, and New York, though already alive with trade, stood on the brink of a transformation so great that few could imagine how deeply it would change the destiny of the city. Along the riverbanks, farmers, sailors, and townsfolk whispered of a ribbon of water, an artificial river, cut by human hands that would join the Hudson to the distant Great Lakes. It was called the Erie Canal. For centuries, the rivers and forests of New York had been the true roads of travel. Native peoples had paddled their canoes along them, Dutch traders had floated furs southward, and English merchants had sailed ships laden with goods to the harbor. But the lands to the west, so rich in soil, so promising in resources, were locked away behind mountains, far from the easy reach of New York's markets. Wagons creaked over rough roads, and pack animals stumbled under heavy burdens. A bushel of grain grown near Buffalo could cost nearly as much to move eastward as to grow. And so, when the idea of carving a canal through the wilderness arose, many laughed at it, calling it Clinton's Ditch, after Governor DeWitt Clinton, who dared to dream it. Yet Clinton believed, with a stubbornness that rivaled the old Dutch traders, that the canal would be the key to New York's greatness. If the waters of Lake Erie could be drawn eastward, connecting with the Hudson and thence to the sea, New York City would become the beating heart of commerce for the young United States. And so, with shovels, picks, and a faith in progress, laborers set to work. They were farmers' sons, Irish immigrants, wandering laborers, and hardy men who believed that the future might rise out of the mud they waded through each day. The canal stretched an impossible 363 miles, crossing forests, swamps, and stony ridges. Men dug by hand, blasting through rock, cutting paths through tangled roots, and damming rivers to feed its waters. For 8 long years the work went on. Along its course, villages sprang up, inns opened to house weary travelers, and towns grew where once there had been only quiet fields. Even in the distant city at the harbor's edge, talk of the canal filled taverns and drawing rooms. Merchants dreamed of wheat and lumber flowing to their warehouses, and ship captains pictured holds heavy with produce bound for Europe. At last, in the autumn of 1825, the work was done. The canal lay gleaming under the sun, a shining path of water stretching westward into the horizon. On October 26th, a great ceremony began. From Buffalo, Governor Clinton boarded a packet boat named the Seneca Chief, which carried 2 wooden barrels filled with water drawn from Lake Erie. As the boat set forth, cannon fire echoed across the towns, for every village along the way was eager to witness the triumph. At each stop, celebrations rang out, bells tolled, crowds cheered, and the boat glided onward, eastward, toward the waiting harbor. When at last the Seneca Chief reached New York City, the excitement was beyond measure. Crowds thronged the waterfront, and banners fluttered in the breeze. The barrels of lake water were lifted high, and in a symbolic act, their contents were poured into the Atlantic Ocean. The Marriage of the Waters, it was called, joining the inland seas to the great salt ocean. Cheers rang out, and fireworks lit the sky. New York had claimed its destiny. The change that followed was swift and deep. Goods that had once cost small fortunes to move now traveled with ease. Wheat, timber, and iron flowed from the western farms and forests into the city's warehouses. In return, tools, cloth, and goods from the city made their way back along the canal to frontier towns. Where before the western frontier had seemed distant, now it was tethered to New York by this liquid road. The city's harbor, already busy, grew crowded with ships. Merchants grew rich, and bankers laid the foundations of wealth that would make New York the financial capital of the nation. But the canal's gift was not only commerce. It carried people, 2 families seeking new land, immigrants chasing new hope, and dreamers moving westward with the promise of open skies. Taverns buzzed with their tales, and the streets of New York grew ever more crowded with the footsteps of newcomers. The canal did not simply carry goods, it carried stories. weaving the nation's vast spaces into a single fabric of shared destiny. And in the quiet hours of evening, as the canal boats drifted by lantern light, one could see in the water the reflection of stars above, and imagine that the city itself was a star rising brighter with every passing year. The Erie Canal was more than stone and water. It was a bridge across time, binding the old ways of river and forest to the new age of iron and industry. By the close of 1825, New York was no longer just a city of merchants and traders at the harbor's edge. It was the nation's great port, the gateway through which goods and dreams alike would pass. The echoes of Dutch settlers, English governors, and revolutionary soldiers still lingered in its streets. But now they were joined by the voices of a bustling, hopeful people looking ever outward. And so, as the canal boats glided under the moonlight, and the waves of the harbor lapped against the shore, New York stood transformed. It had risen from native hunting grounds to Dutch outpost, from colonial town to revolutionary stage. Now, with the Erie Canal complete, it was ready to claim its place as the beating heart of a young America city forever watching the horizon, waiting for the next tide to carry it forward. And so our journey comes to rest. From the quiet footsteps of native hunters, to the thunder of cannon fire in revolution, from Dutch traders bargaining in the market to canal boats gliding under moonlight, the story of New York before 1825 has unfolded like a great tapestry. What was once a patchwork of villages and wooden streets has become the gateway to a new world, bound forever to the rivers, the ocean, and the dreams of those who came to its shores. As the waters of the Erie Canal joined lake to sea, so to have these chapters joined past to present. And though our tale rests here tonight, the spirit of New York, ever restless, continues beyond the horizon. Now, as the echoes of history fade, may your mind grow quiet, and may sleep take you gently, as steady as the tide against the harbor walls. Rest well, traveler, and dream in the company of time.